Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 13 of our reading of Neptune 1 is Missing. It is a novel by Hugh Walters, and we have the copyright information right here. Neptune was Missing, copyright 1969 by Hugh Walters, first American edition, all rights reserved, including the right to reproduce this book or portions thereof in any form. So, yeah, that's what we're going by, and we are going to switch back to the title. In the last part, the Neptune 1 crew managed to get through to control, but Chris wanted to go and inspect the hull, but he was going to basically sacrifice himself to save the crew, but they found another way, I think. We're going to see. The book is almost done, so we're going to pick up. And they can all see that there's something that Sir George Benson is having a crisis. But anyways, it would take at least... Okay, wait. Though he hadn't revealed his thoughts to any of his colleagues, they could see that something had upset Sir George. His face had gone very drawn, and Whiskers and Mr. Gilliander sensed that he was near a relapse. His hand had shaken visibly when it held the microphone. They stood by him with growing anxiety. It would take at least 3 minutes for his words to reach the distant spaceship. In that time, Chris could have left Neptune 1 and given the nose that fateful kick. Of course, he might be completely wrong. Chris might never have thought of anything but seeing the outer casing for himself. If that was so, and the jet guns were empty, would it not be putting the idea into the astronaut's mind if he voiced his fears? He must take the risk. He must assume the worst and alert the other members of the crew. In spite of Tony's protests, Chris insisted on making the external inspection himself. The mechanic was really upset. Couldn't his leader trust him? It was his job, and he'd done it scores of times before. If damage was found, it would be he, Tony, who would have to repair it, but Chris's orders had been peremptory, so Tony hid his hurt feelings as Maury and Serge assisted their leader to prepare for his excursion. Hardly had Chris, with his casual wave of a hand, stepped into the airlock when the radio spoke. Sir George Benson's voice sounded strained, and his command was urgent. Chris was not to carry out the external inspection as yet, and they were to report if they had any life left in the jet guns. It was too late to recall Chris now. By the time he'd be opening the outer door and stepping into space while the crew were still wondering what this was all about, the voice of Sir George continued. Maury, Tony, Serge, it is. If Chris has already left the ship, you must contact him by his helmet radio. I fear he intends to set you turning by pushing off into space from the nose. If he does this, he'll be lost. If there is pressure in either of your jet guns, it can be used to put the ship in motion. Quickly, now. Get Chris back and look at those guns. So that was it. In a flash, Tony knew why his leader had insisted on going outside. How blind he'd been. And why hadn't he had the same idea himself, like Maury and Serge had blamed him for not anticipating... Like Maury and Serge, he blamed himself for not anticipating Chris, but they must waste no time on idle regrets. Action was necessary. Maury went over to the radio by which he could call Chris. Tony and Serge rushed to the rack holding their jet guns. They were all there, so Chris hadn't bothered to take one with him. Maury tried to reach Chris on the radio, but in vain. He had cut off the receiver, and there was no way of contacting him. Tony and Serge examined all the jet guns. It was as they feared. There wasn't an ounce of pressure left in any of them. Chapter 19. Empty, gasped Tony, after the last jet gun had been tested. He isn't answering, declared Maury, when Chris failed to respond. The horror of the situation came home to them. Sir George, millions of miles away, had been able to guess what Chris was thinking of, while they, his own crew members, had failed. Instinctively, they knew that Sir George was right. What are we going to do? I'm going out after him, Maury announced. But you can only go the length of the safety line. Surge pointed out. If Chris has pushed off, you'll never reach him. And don't say that you'll push off after him without a jet gun to steer you. You couldn't even go in the same direction. However, Maury was already climbing into his spacesuit. If he's in reach, I'm going to grab him, he said. Surge went over to help him. Wait, cried Tony, I have an idea. The other two astronauts paused, wondering what he had in mind. Tony had taken the jet gun over to the oxygen supply line. With a few deft twists, he removed part of the valve. Then he inserted a small length of rubber tube, which he'd produced from the depths of his quote-unquote junk cupboard. The other end he slipped over the inlet valve of one of the jet guns, and with a twist of wire, secured it in position. Even as Maury realized that Tony was about to try charging the gun with oxygen, Tony opened a cock, and they could all hear the hissing of the high-pressure gas. Normally, the jet guns were charged with nitrogen, converted by pressure to liquid form, yet there was no reason why oxygen shouldn't do the same job, except that it was too precious. As a rule, no one in a spaceship would dream of using this vital gas for anything but sustaining life. Usually the problem was to conserve oxygen, but here was Tony almost committing sacrilege. Would it be effective? That was all that mattered. If it could get Chris back and turn the ship, then they would willingly sacrifice their last gasp of oxygen. Tony handed the gun to Maury, who was now ready to enter the airlock. There was no time to test the gun. It would just have to work. Outside the ship, Chris had paused for a moment to take in the sight of his craft as he reflected back. As reflecting back the distant sun, it appeared to hang motionless in the black and starry sky. While still in the airlock, he'd switched off his helmet radio. He didn't want any painful arguments with his friends if they should guess what he was about to do. The safety line was snaking about in a lifeless condition. Chris had ignored it. He must make his push as powerful as possible. What would be the reaction of Maury, Surge, and Tony when he switched on his helmet radio to tell them what he'd done? He would have preferred to leave it in silence, but he must warn his friends so they would be prepared to start the rocket motor as soon as the ship had turned in the right direction. Chris was right at the ship's nose now, and he braced himself for his last great effort. Sir George Benson was racked with anxiety as he waited for the minutes to pass. His assistants had all heard his frantic instructions to the rest of the crew to persuade Chris to return, should he have left the vessel. And they, too, could see that the astronauts must have worked out how to save his friends if all else failed. A deathly stillness spread as everyone awaited a reply. It came after what seemed an endless time. Chris has left the ship, the voice of Surge said, and everyone could sense the effort he was making to speak calmly. We have checked the guns, and all are empty, he went on, and Sir George couldn't suppress a groan. Tony is trying to charge one of the guns with compressed oxygen. Maury is suited and ready to go out. Charge a gun with oxygen? Of course, it should be possible. Now that the ship was relatively close to Earth, there was no longer the same need to conserve the precious gas, as they all knew. Tony's skill, as they all knew, If the job was possible, then the director had little doubt that his best mechanic could manage it. But suppose Chris had already kicked himself off into space, it would be virtually impossible to go after him. So the agony of suspense must continue. Not until he knew the gun would work and was doing the job instead of Chris could Sir George relax. His friends were worried about the effect the situation was having upon him. His hands, much thinner than they used to be, were trembling. His face had again lost that touch of returning color. Much more of this, and the director would die in his chair. It was as Chris was bracing himself for the last mighty effort of his life that he took a last glance down the length of the ship. His heart nearly stopped when he saw a suited figure emerge from the airlock and wave at him frantically. Chris's first reaction was anger that one of the crew had dared to follow him outside the ship. Whoever it was would try to stop him from doing the job he'd resolved to do. He must push off at once before he could be prevented, his knees bent ready for the fateful spring. He paused. The someone who had followed him was waving something. It was a jet gun, as if to draw attention to what he held. The second astronaut released a blast from the gun and came shooting towards his leader. A second blast in the opposite direction brought him to a halt at Chris's side. Chris was utterly and completely staggered. He'd secretly looked at every gun before he decided to sacrifice himself. All had seemed empty. Yet, here was one of his friends using a gun that most certainly had some power in it. Now a hand was laid firmly on his arm. It was too late to carry out his plan. His muscles relaxed, and a tumult of feelings welled over him. Maury was making signals that Chris should switch on the helmet radio. Like an automaton, the crew leader complied. "Hold on, Chris," the voice of Maury sounded urgently. "We've got a gun working," Sir George rumbled. "That you're up rumbled what you're up to, and warned us. Come inside, Chris." Chris's feelings were very mixed. Astonishment and wily old Uncle George had guessed his intention. Wonder that a gun should be working when a few minutes before they had all been dead. Relief that a gun could do the turning job more efficiently than he could. "What have you done to that gun?" he asked. "The gauges were all at zero when I looked at them." "Tony has pumped some oxygen into this one," Maury told him. "And it works, see?" So saying, he let out a squirt, and he and Chris floated away. "All right," Chris conceded, but I don't know that he's done the job. Let's see if we can get the old ship twisting." Arm in arm, the two astronauts propelled themselves back to the nose from where Chris had just been prepared to jump. As they settled into position, the airlock opened and out shot Surge, complete with his gun. "Getting crowded out here," Maury's voice declared as Surge joined them. Is your gun working too?" asked Chris, and Surge demonstrated that it was. "Why didn't I think of the oxygen?" sighed Chris. "Well, let's get the old boat turning." Under this direction, Maury shot 3 blasts away into space while clinging to the nose. "That should do it," Chris said. "We better get back inside." Meanwhile, Tony, who had been listening in to their conversation, reported the good news to Control. By the time the 3 astronauts were all inside the cabin, the message had reached Sir George and the director of UNEXA, the man in charge of the Earth's exploration of this Earth's exploration of space rejoiced. "Is she turning?" asked Maury as he removed his spacesuit. Tony returned from the observation post where he'd been watching the starfield. "They're definitely moving," he announced. Chris joined him and watched for a moment. The brilliant suns scattered over the velvet backcloth were all moving slowly. Neptune 1 was indeed turning right around. "We've done it," Tony shouted with excitement. "You mean you've done it," Surge said, clapping his hand on Tony's shoulders. "If you hadn't thought up that oxygen trick, we'd never have made it." "Nonsense," answered Tony modestly. "One of you would have thought of a way somehow." There was an awkward silence for a moment as it came back to them that one of their number had indeed thought of a way of positioning their ship, but at an awful cost. "We'd better make some measurements," Chris said, to overcome the embarrassment of the moment. They set to, and with the aid of optical instruments, arrived at the conclusion that it would take Neptune 1 5 minutes to twist through a complete half cycle. "Then we shall be able to blast off for home," Maury said with relief. "You're not forgetting that we must go out again and kill the twist, are you?" Chris answered. What he meant was that now force in the shape of blasts from Maury's and Surge's jet guns had been applied to set the ship in motion. It would take an equal and opposite force to stop her in the right direction. Otherwise, Neptune 1 would continue the turning movement perpetually. Won't the rocket blast do that? Asked Tony. No, I'm afraid our momentum is too great for that, Chris answered. If we used other means, and here he smiled a little grimly, it might have done so. All we have to do then is to go out and shoot our guns in the other direction, Maury said. Fine. Get back into your suits, Surgeon Maury. I'll call you when it's time to fire your jets, Chris told them. Yippee! Who's for a trip around the Mayflower? Tony called. Now the astronauts were nearing home, just a matter of mere 28 million miles or so. They felt as happy as if the ship had already landed, almost as if they were racing from Neptune 1 to join their friends from Control. Sir George would be there, and Whiskers, good old Whiskers, to say nothing of Billy Gillianders and the others. Soon they would be soaking in hot baths, after which they would eat the meal of their lives. No more space food, that nourishing but uninteresting diet that the astronauts hated. Come on, you two. If you're too late getting out onto the nose, we'll have to make another complete turn before we're in position again, so look lively, Chris told them, with mock severity. With more signs of the gaiety they all felt, Maury and Serge continued putting on their suits. At last, they were ready to enter the airlock. The helmet radios were tested. As soon as we're lined up on Antares, naming their target star, I'll tell you to blast, Chris told them. Follow my orders carefully and cut off the instant I tell you. If you give it too much, we'll start turning the other way. If that should happen, one of you will have to nip pretty smartly over the other side and give a squirt to steady the ship. Understood? Maury and Serge replied cheerfully that they quite understood. Now they were only waiting for Tony to pass them their recharged jet guns. A strange look came over Tony's face. Without a word, he picked up the two guns that Maury and Serge had brought back with them from their previous excursion. In turn, he pressed the triggers. There was barely a puff from either. In their enthusiasm, the astronauts had almost emptied them. You'll have to fill them again, Chris grinned. I can't, Tony replied in a strangled voice. A chill struck the astronauts. In a flash, the gaiety of the moment before had vanished. They looked at Tony with growing horror. Why not, Tony? Chris asked, struggling to keep his voice as calm as possible. Because the oxygen pressure in the storage vessel is too low. Filling the guns once has used up nearly all our spare gas, Tony replied. I can't fill them again. But this third gun is okay, asked Maury. Tony nodded miserably. It doesn't take much to understand that if the force of two guns had been used to set Neptune 1 turning, it would also take the force of two guns to stop it. And all they had was one gun, not enough to do the job. Chapter 20. It was the cruelest blow of all. This was a disaster brought on not by bad luck, not by something over which they had no control, but by their own foolishness. If they had stopped to think, they would have used one gun to set the ship in motion, and one to stop it, with the last one held in reserve. Of course, it would have taken longer for Neptune 1 to turn around, but that would have been far better than their present hopeless position. Serge and Maury felt devastated by the result of their impulsive action. When all had seemed set fair for the homeward run, they had thrown away their last chance. Chris, too, felt that as leader of the crew, he was to blame. He should not have permitted both guns to be discharged until he had made sure that there was enough power left to counteract the effect. It was he who had failed his crew and Uncle George. Well, it was no use. He must report to Control and confess the greatest error of his life to the man who, more than any other, had made him an astronaut. It would have been far better if he had carried out his original idea, while the other members of the crew fought their battle against despair. He took the microphone. What was this? Chris's voice was sounding again over the loudspeaker. Surely it was to say that Neptune 1 had been reversed and was now in position to decelerate. As he was being wheeled into his office, Sir George ordered the girl who was pushing him to stop while he concentrated on listening to the good news. It was only slowly that he realized that what Chris was saying. They had made the ship turn, but now they were unable to stop it. Chris went on to explain how it had happened and took full responsibility for the disaster. When he had finished, a dreadful silence fell on that crowded room, and gradually all eyes turned on Sir George. The Neptune expedition must now be written off, and for the director, this must be the end. Yet Sir George was being pushed back to the microphone. Neptune 1, this is control calling. Disregard the part and disregard the past and concentrate on the future. Slow down the turning as much as possible, but keep some energy in reserve. You are to run the atomic motor while turning through 15 degrees each side of your correct flight path. This will make your overall deceleration about 60% of what it should have been. We will work out the next move. Over. Sir George was going to make a last desperate gamble to bring Neptune 1 home. Even if the ship had been pointed in the right direction, it could have been slowed down only just sufficiently. By decelerating it over a 30-degree arc, the motor could be run for only 1/12th of its time. It looked a hopeless task, but what else was there to do? How like Uncle George, Chris thought. Not a word of recrimination, only concern for the future. Chris, Maury, and Serge could see that the director was attempting, and what the director was attempting, and they refused to weigh up their chance of success. We could increase the period of deceleration if we slowed the turn while the motor is running, Chris said thoughtfully. How's that? Tony asked. We're turning at a steady rate, explained Chris. No matter how much we can slow this down, the 30-degree arc represents 1/12th of a complete revolution. If we do all the slowing down during the 30 degrees, it will increase the time we are in this arc compared with the rest of the turn. But only while we are slowing down, Serge pointed out. True, Chris agreed, but it will be a worthwhile exercise. Could we use the chemical motor until we've finished braking? Asked Maury. It's so much more powerful than the ion drive. Good idea, conceded Chris. We'll tell control. At least it shows they are still using their heads, Sir George pointed out to Whiskers and Mr. Gillianders after he'd agreed to Chris's suggestion. None of the three had any illusions about the crew's chances of survival, but it was good to know that they were still fighting. I'll go out, Chris decided, ignoring the protests of the others. I'll use my gun as you start the chemical motor. Then you better see that your safety line is all right, Maury grumbled. And you'll have to hang on like grim death. Chris was aware of the danger. As the ship slowed down under the thrust of the rocket motor, he would shoot on ahead of it unless he could maintain hold of a hand grip. Some minutes later, sorry about that. Chris was aware of the danger. As the ship slowed down under the thrust of the rocket motor, he would shoot on ahead of it unless he could maintain hold of a hand grip. Some minutes later, he was outside, gun in one hand and the other holding tightly to one of the grips. Maury was in charge of the rocket firing, and Serge was plotting the ship's turns. 10 seconds, Tony called over Chris's helmet radio, and the crew leader braced himself. A great tongue of flame suddenly leapt from the tail of Neptune 1. At the same time, Chris felt his arm almost torn from the socket, but he managed to hang on and raise his jet gun to fire. How puny the burst from the little gun seemed when compared with the gigantic flame from the chemical motor, yet each was vitally important if Neptune and its crew were to be saved. Chris held down the trigger until he judged that he'd expended about half of the power. Then he concentrated on holding on to the ship until the motor was shut off. It was a great relief to return to the cabin. There, following a long, tedious operation, the atomic motor was now used during each of the ship's turns. It was switched on as Neptune 1 entered the critical arc and off again as it turned out. Control was monitoring the results anxiously. Chris's actions had slowed the ship's twist considerably. After much thought, Sir George ordered him outside again to use the last ounce of power in his gun. It was going to be a terribly near thing to decelerate the ship sufficiently for it to enter the Earth's orbit. Chris complied, and then returned to his friends with an empty gun. The great computer at Cape Kennedy was now the most important piece of equipment in the world, as scientists fed into it masses of data about the happenings on Neptune 1. The machine printed hundreds of yards of paper tape. Other staff were studying the tape and interpreting the computer's findings. Sir George read their reports feverishly. "We'll do it," he announced triumphantly. "It's hopeless," he groaned a moment later, and so on, and so it fluctuated. We don't have very many pages left, but I think that we will end it here. We're going to leave it on a cliffhanger here. And we're going to basically finish this book up in the next part. Anyways, we have been reading from Neptune 1 is Missing. This is a novel by Hugh Walters. If you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, all the information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.